Well, as part of this series on the Smith & Wesson 1000, let's take apart this trigger assembly. Hi, Jim Humphrey from Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. And let's disassemble the Smith Wesson 1000 trigger assembly. Let's start by dropping the hammer, pushing up on that little top safety with my thumb, pulling the trigger. That allows me then to pull out the carrier spring guide pin and then the carrier. That'll expose the carrier spring and the carrier spring sleeve, followed by the hammer spring and the hammer spring sleeve. Now I'm going to remove the hammer, but that's not something I would ordinarily do for regular cleaning. The hammer pin is a groove pin, so it's a little fatter on one end, the end with the grooves in it. So I'm going to have to hammer it out from right to left in this case. So I'll go from the skinny end of the pin to the fatter end of the pin. Take a closer look at this pin, you'll see what I mean. There's these grooves stamped in the end of the pin, which swells out the end of the pin. So you always have to drive away from the grooved end. The trigger pin just pushes out. That will then release the trigger and the trigger spring. The sear is held in by a blind pin. You have to kind of just pull it out with a friction grip, and that'll cause the sear to fall out. Then when I pull the trigger plate pins bushing, that actually releases the safety. And then there's also a safety pin that needs to be knocked out to release the spring. It just pushes out. I'm careful to note the orientation of that spring and the spring legs before I pull that safety out. I'll just leave that spring attached so that I don't lose track of it. Next, the safety button is held in with a stopper pin. So I'm going to push it out, but I'm careful to cover it because it's retaining the spring and sleeve that act as a detent on that safety button. So there's a spring underneath there, and then there's a sleeve that spring fits into. Sometimes they fall right out, sometimes need a little help. Okay, well, now that we've got it completely apart, let's review some nomenclature. So the hammer spring and hammer spring sleeve, the hammer pin, carrier spring guide pin and the carrier, and then the carrier spring and its sleeve, the sear and the sear pin, and the safety and the safety pin and its spring, and then the trigger plate, general assembly, and the trigger plate pin bushing, safety button and all its parts, and the trigger, its pin and spring. The safety button has these grooves on top of it. They have to face up because they're going to engage with that spring sleeve. And the red side goes to the left. Okay, get that spring sleeve in there, the spring and the pin, the stopper pin, to hold it all together. I'm going to use a small punch to compress that spring, and then press that stopper pin across to retain everything. So this is the orientation for the sear and the sear spring. I drop it right into the trigger plate. First thing I do is get that sear spring pin in there. The pin just presses in. I don't want to hammer it because it's getting caught up in the legs of this spring, so I have to finesse that spring a little bit to just get that pin to slide across. So the bushing just presses in, but it's a pretty close fit. This special tool is actually from a Remington 870 trigger for doing exactly the same thing with a bushing. It allows me to line everything up and just push it across. So I've laid out the trigger and the sear to show the orientation. That's the trigger pin, sear pin. Here's the sear. Here's how the hammer engages that sear. So this is just to show you the orientation before I put it in. And the back of the sear is just cut out for the trigger spring. The sear just slides in, and the sear pin goes in that blind hole, presses down. A little tough to line them up sometimes. Found those forceps are pretty handy. And then I need to flip it over like that to get the orientation correct for the trigger spring. Drop the trigger in, get it straddling that safety, and then I can put the spring in place and the trigger pin. I was going to use this alignment pin to grab that hole, the trigger in the hole, but the hole lined up perfectly, so sometimes you just get lucky and things line up. Hammer goes in next. There's that grooved hammer pin. So the grooved in goes in last, skinny in goes in first. Now I can put in the hammer spring and that hammer spring sleeve. You can tell this is an older model because it's still using the steel hammer spring sleeve as opposed to the plastic one. And then the carrier spring and carrier spring sleeve. And I get this carrier lined up. And getting that carrier spring guide pin in there is bushing is a little bit challenging, so I'm using another tool to help line things up here. And this tool is a knitting needle, an aluminum knitting needle. I bought a set of them. They come in different diameters. Very handy for this kind of work. So that's about all there is to it. Do a quick little test on it, make sure everything's moving freely, and safety button works, and safety lever works. As always, enjoy your firearms, keep training, stay safe out there.